It's 100 degrees outside right now, and the high is expected to get to 108 today. But we're doing Christmas in July. If you want to start learning how to make quilts, it's actually a very good idea to start with something smaller, like a table runner or a Christmas tree skirt. Especially if you're going to be quilting them on a home sewing machine, as they're smaller and a little easier to maneuver, and you don't have all of this big bulky fabric that you have to move around as you're quilting. These are some squares that I started piecing together 3 years ago. I had wanted to make a length of fabric to make some Christmas stockings out of. I've now changed my mind and want to make a Christmas tree skirt out of this length of fabric. So I've got a little bit on the side and on the top and bottom to complete. It's made out of 3.5-inch squares, so it's very scrappy looking and would work well if you had a casual or farmhouse type of Christmas decor. So right now it's measuring 29.5 inches by about 36 inches. And when I've done Christmas tree skirts before, I like to do them so that they're 42 inches in diameter. I went looking for Christmas fabric the end of May and couldn't find anything that I liked. And so I came home and one day looked through my fabric stash, and I found these two fabrics. I was going to use the candy cane print for the back and the snowflake for the binding, but I think that I'm going to have enough of the candy cane print to use for the binding as well. I had a lot of the squares of fabric already cut, so I laid them out so that I would get the right placement of them before I sewed them. I needed 2 rows on one side, 2 rows on the top, and 2 more rows on the bottom. I then stacked them up in the order that I would sew them. So to the machine to chain piece them all together, the first and the second square together, the third and the fourth together, and then the fifth and the sixth squares together, and so on. Then I cut those pieces apart, opened them up, and finger pressed them, and then stacked them in order also. Then I chain pieced those pieces together, sewing the first and the second set together, the third and the fourth, and then the fifth on the end of the fourth. Once I did the first column to the side piece, I did the second column, and then I sewed those two together. So that's what I'm doing right here. I like to take the middle part first and match up the seams, and then work outwards until everything's pinned and ready to sew together. I can't tell you how many bad quilts I made before I learned how to nest seams together. If you make sure those 2 seams are nested together tightly, then your intersections and your points will always match. I used to think that if my cutting of my fabric was accurate, that it would just naturally line up. But things can get off the tiniest amount and cause it not to align. And here's how all the intersections matched up. I'm giving everything a little press before I sew on the new piece that I just made onto the bigger piece. And now I've matched up the intersections and nested the seams, and I'm sewing those two pieces together. And there are a few intersections that aren't spot on, like this one. But in my opinion, it's not bad enough to rip it out and do it over again. So if you look for imperfections, you'll find them in my quilting. Here, I'm finding the center and marking it with the pin. To help aid me in placement and see if I have enough squares, I just take my tape measure and pull it around like that to see if I can make a 42-inch circle. Now I'm just placing the squares out for the rest of the rows on the top and the bottom, and then I'm stacking them, and I'll take them to the machine and do the same procedure that I did for the side. When the pieces are sewn to the top and the bottom, then I take it over to the ironing board. So I want to make sure that everything is pressed really well so that it lays flat. And don't look too closely because the back to this quilt top is a mess, but I'm going to use it anyway. And now I'm also ironing the backing. I rolled up the carpet in my family room and cleaned the tile really well, and then laid the backing face down, right side down, onto the floor and taped it, stretching it a little taut. Next, I put the batting over top. I laid the top piece on top of the batting just to be able to get an idea of how much to trim off. Then I put my cutting mat underneath the batting and the backing and cut with my rotary blade. so that I could trim it off. I smoothed out the batting and the top layers really well, and so now I'm ready to pin my sandwich together. And I'm just pinning in the middle of every green square with my safety pins. There are 10 squares on the first row, 12 squares on the second row, and 14 squares from the 3rd to the 10th rows, 12 squares on the 11th row, and 10 squares on the 12th row. I am going to machine quilt this by doing stitch in the ditch quilting or stitching, but I actually think another option for this that would be equally as attractive would be to hand tie it or tie quilt it using embroidery floss and a nice cranberry. It would be really pretty, I think. I'm using a thread color that matches the back perfectly. And I've put my walking foot, presser foot, onto my machine. I roll up the side that I have in the arm or the throat of the machine, and I start stitching in the middle, but at the top. After the first pass, I moved my machine to the wide side of my table so that I would have better control and was able to put the excess fabric on the table, and that helps me control it a little better. Wait for it. So whoops, did you see that? I may go back and pick out just an inch or two and then stitch back over it to make it look better, or I may just leave it. No one's going to be trying to find imperfections in a quilt, especially if it's a Christmas tree skirt. You may think differently if you do a mistake like this, but that's up to you. When I finished doing the stitch in the ditch stitching vertically, I turned the quilt and did the stitching horizontally. It took me an hour or maybe an hour and a half to do all of this machine quilting. I didn't time it. I wish I had, but I know that it wasn't longer than an hour and a half. Okay, so here's where it gets a little sketchy or dicey. And I've made about 3 or 4, now I can't remember, 4 I think, of these tree skirts without any problems before, but my sojo must have been off this day because I just couldn't make it work right. But it's okay, it all ended up well in the end. So the idea is to find the middle of the quilt and then to connect a string or a piece of yarn onto the pin and then use it as a compass. I attached a friction pin at the end of it, and so I was trying to use it as a compass to make a circle on this quilt that I've made. And I think it would have been better if I had the quilt on a table doing it and had somebody to help me, but I was on the floor and I was doing it by myself. I couldn't find my chalk pen, and the friction pen wasn't working right. It was brand new, but it wasn't working right for some reason. But if you have chalk, use chalk. I think works better unless you have an all-white tree skirt. But for the darker colors, try it with chalk. Since I couldn't get an even line or even round circle the whole way around, I was able to get a quarter of the circle with a good line. So I cut a quarter of the circle, and then I folded the tree skirt in half and cut the other quarter out, and then folded that piece in half and cut out the remaining circle. One thing that messed me up that I didn't show was that I had messed up the alignment from the quilt top to the backing. So the backing was short about 1 inch on one side. So if you'll see in the video, I went back and recut it, and the tree skirt's going to be smaller than I had originally planned. This is a Christmas tree skirt that I made 8 years ago, and you may recognize it from my trunk show video. I found a glass that matched the opening of the older Christmas tree skirt, and so that's what I'm going to use to trace the opening on this. And it's clear up at the very top. I didn't have it in very good frame, but you can see I'm marking it with the pen, and then I'm drawing a line that I will cut for the opening as well. And so I'm just using my rotary cutter and ruler to make that opening, and then I use the scissors to cut the circle out. And if you're wondering, yes, it is very scary to go at a quilt that you've been making with a rotary cutter. So now it's ready for the binding, and I'm going to make that next. Most of you already know this, but for those of you that are just beginning, whenever you make something that has a curve or is round, you need to cut the binding on the bias so that it will be stretchier and it will stretch without puckering. And I'm sure there are better ways to do this, but this is how I chose to do it this day. I am making the binding 2 1/4 inches wide. If you need more detail on how to make binding and attach binding, I will leave the link for the tutorial that Jenny Doan did on binding quilts. And you can also check out my teal and gray quilt tutorial. I think that goes into a little more detail than I'm doing here. After I connected the strips together, then I trimmed the edges and folded it in half and pressed it. So now I'm just attaching the binding to the tree skirt. I forgot to mention that you match up the raw edges of the binding with the raw edge of the skirt, the tree skirt. So then when you're done and you flip the binding over to the back to stitch it up, you've got a nice finished edge on your backing. After I sewed the binding on by machine, then I flipped it over to the back and finished it off by hand sewing it. And voila! Here you have the patchwork Christmas tree skirt for Christmas in July. You have enough time to make this for Christmas if you want. It's pretty easy and forgiving, as you can see, with all the mistakes I made. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.